So my atomic clock is saying that it's 8 o'clock, and we can continue the other part of the movie night, which is the discussion. And there's three of us here. Let me introduce you shortly. Who do we have here? So to my immediate left is Jan Haken, who is a professor emeritus of psychology at Portland State University, a clinical psychologist and documentalist. So it was her film. Her internationally acclaimed documentaries focus on people doing stressful jobs at the outskirts of society, to put it shortly. And then we have to the far left is Mr. Casper, however you pronounce it in English. He's a junior lecturer of communication science at the University of Tartu, and also, I would say, a technology critic. He teaches courses such as technology and innovation, social theories, leadership and strategic thinking, and rhetorics. And me, I'm Madis, again, work on the energy and climate issues at the Estonian Green Movement. Also, I've been a member of the National Nuclear Energy Working Group, sub-working group, and also active in this pan-European network, Nuclear Transparency Watch. But today I try to be the guide of this conversation and speak little myself. And with this, I will, the hope for me is that around 30 minutes is we discussing, and if somebody has a burning question, they can raise their hand. We have a microphone somewhere moving around, but then at 30 minutes, I would open it up to the whole audience. Or maybe our talk is shorter, who knows? But I wanted to start out with Jan, because it was your movie, you made it. It was all your work and your crew. So you have made documentaries on very different subjects, from refugee camps, war zones, abortion clinics, drag bars, dairy farms, and hip-hop clubs. That's what I read online. So how does this nuclear topic came about?
It's on now? On now.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for inviting me here to this lovely city and to be here in Estonia, and to the Estonian Green Movement for welcoming me here. Thank you all for coming tonight. My documentaries came out of my field research. For many decades, I took camera and crew into different places of the world to capture more of the lived experience of people in a kind of ethnographic style of research. And then I became interested in actually making films that are watchable more than in libraries, and to bring this medium of the documentary into topics that are hard for people to think about. All of my films deal with topics that generate anxiety, where people kind of shut things down or oversimplify. And thinking of the documentary form as a way of kind of holding a history of experience together in a way that people can then make use of history, make use of experiences that are maybe fleetingly on the news, briefly on the news, but then pass. And certainly that's true with this topic of nuclear power. It came out of two previous films I made in 2019 and 2022 on the use of the necessity defense, a legal strategy that activists were using in seeking out jury trials around civil disobedience in the climate movement. And out of that, many of the activists, particularly the Confederated tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, you saw them featured here, Kathy Sampson Cruz has said, you know, these young environmentalists, they're not paying attention to what's going on with nuclear power. It's just not on their radar. And I still work with students a lot on my teams and in my projects. And a lot of them say, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. These small nuclear reactors, that sounds pretty cool. Let's give it a whirl. Throw everything we have at it. And that became kind of a mantra or a phrase repeated over and over I wanted to bring into this film, was this idea of, well, just throw everything we have at the problem of the climate crisis and see what sticks. And there are costs of that. And I've done several films in war zones, one in Afghanistan and refugee camps, and no military commander would say, just throw everything you have at it, though maybe that's what's happening in Ukraine, I don't know. But it's, You know, you have to be thoughtful about how we approach the climate crisis. And there's a kind of gold rush in the US, a lot of hustling around this stuff. And I became interested in the history of propaganda, actually, around nuclear power. So the film is really about the history of nuclear propaganda. And as a psychologist, I was interested in how you sell things to people that make them anxious, and reasonably anxious. And one way they've been selling this in the US, promoting it massively, is by portraying old people as radiophobic. Is there, you know how to interpret that word, radiophobic? Fearful. Old people are, you know, hung up on this, but young people are not so afraid of it. And so there was this intergenerational dynamic around the propaganda that also interested me. A lot of my films have to do with intergenerational dynamics and how you pass on experience and stories from one generation to the next. And so I felt like there was so much hostility in the US toward my generation of old anti-nuclear activists and portraying them as kind of hung over on the past. And I felt like the film was a way of kind of revisiting that history and paying some tribute to it. And it's not as though things are the same now, but I think there's a lot to learn from that history, and I also wanted to pay tribute to that, as well as the tribes in the US that have a very far-reaching view of the impacts of capitalist initiatives that are short-sighted and always over-promising and under-delivering on those promises.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention that each of us has some sort of background in psychology as well. So today we will be focusing more on the bamboozle part and less on the atomic part or the science or in engineering behind it. But because the other parts are also very important. So coming to Kaspar, like you have been writing and teaching about technology, innovation, social issues. So how did you came about nuclear, or how did nuclear find you? A small story, if you remember.
I think it's the same as it was with you, because well, we don't have nuclear in Estonia, right? And it hasn't been an issue. There's been talks. There have been nuclear waste here from weapons. And there's still nuclear waste in Estonia, or radioactive waste, I should say. And now, just a few years ago, we suddenly had this sort of initiative, this refreshing the discourse on nuclear.
Renaissance.
A renaissance, you could say, that came almost out of nowhere, but it wasn't quite nowhere. It was exactly one company who had decided to bring small modular reactors to Estonia, the only problem being that these reactors don't really exist. And then you have to sell the unicorn that doesn't exist and won't exist. And at that point already, I was quite critical of technology, since, well, I think we'll get there. And it was only natural to look at this sort of push for nuclear from a very skeptical viewpoint, saying, hey, if it's this great, then why do you have to sell it so badly? So why the rush? Why are there commissions in ministries, and why is there this sort of media frenzy that seems almost engineered? And now we have nuclear youth. I don't know if they're active still, but that was a thing. And politicians, no-name politicians, started talking about nuclear as if they'd gotten a stone thrown at their head and then woken up and gone, oh, I think nuclear is great. So what happened here? And that just made me skeptical, and I've been yelling at people about it for years now. And now you're subject to it today as well.
Yeah, so thinking about the film, there's like this recurring themes of the Trojan brand, the Hanford site. So I guess in the States, you have many examples to pick from. And in Estonia, we, as Kaspar mentioned, we have this one site in Paldiski, which is this old Soviet nuclear site. But other than that, we have like no examples of I don't know, past activism on this topic. So a question to Jan is like, why did you pick these examples? Or are these like the most glaring examples of how the industry is kind of giving out these false promises?
Well, I mean, there are different settings in the film. Most of it's in the Pacific Northwest, and the Columbia River is, as Lauren Goldberg, one of the attorneys in film, said, it's kind of the lifeblood of the Pacific Northwest, and has a tragic history of dams built and various projects along that history that have been very destructive to tribal people in that area. And so it's set in the Northwest, and Hanford is like a graveyard nearby. And when I moved to Oregon, I didn't know anything about Hanford, even though it's the largest Superfund waste site in North America. I mean, it's staggering.
You need to define Superfund because it sounds so nice. It sounds super. It sounds super, but actually it means something different.
It's a program that several decades ago with a vast amount of federal funds in the U.S. going to cleaning up major toxic waste that the government or companies left behind, and billions of dollars goes into trying to clean up the legacy of not just the nuclear weapons produced there that were dropped on Nagasaki in this case, but also the nuclear power industry emerge as well. And producing nuclear energy, also a lot of the plutonium for the first generation of nuclear weapons after World War II. And I wanted to show in the film the history of just promising over and over, no, it's okay, the fish are fine, we're cleaning, all these old scientists who are giving reassuring public relations statements, and it's a horrifying mess there. But when I visited there last summer and I was working on this film, one thing I learned from the Yakama Nation people there that still are very attached to that area and are one of the tribes in that area is it's not enough to talk about the horror show, the cemetery of the nuclear industry that's at Hanford. It's also important to talk about the beauty of the area. And so I wanted in this film to have a sense of, and I'm sure you have that here, not just documenting the destructiveness we're facing, but there's much beauty, awesome beauty in the world still to protect. So I hope you got a feeling of that for the Columbia River, for that Hanford site. The desert there still means a lot to tribal people. But also I didn't have very much money to travel.
Fair enough, fair enough.
But also there's something about the attachment to place that is also a tribal focus that you have, it's important to bring forward the attachment to place and the beauty of place.
If I can interject, I think that in the film also the point that was made about these decisions being made by people who don't live there and won't live there. And I think we're getting a sense of it here in Estonia with some locations being discussed for a potential plant. And you have this almost preemptive framing of the people living there who might be opposed to the thing as irrational, or you shouldn't get emotional about in a discussion. We should have a rational discussion. There's nothing to be emotional about here. You should be a rational decision, and there's no room for irrationality in this very rational discussion. And but we live here. Please don't build a nuclear plant next to our home. No, that's NIMBY. No, you shouldn't. That's bad. But why is it bad if people don't want a nuclear plant in their backyard? That doesn't make any sense frame these people as irrational when their emotionality is very much justified in the situation. And if you look at, well, the US is big, right? But if you look at Estonia, which is tiny, we're talking about everyone's backyard. Like in case of spilling some of those toxic wastes that there's no solution for, and they're going to be cooling in a yard, in a shed, pretty much for decades anyway, even before they're buried underground, if they're buried. Like that affects every one of us. It's our backyard collectively. So this, I find it very interesting, this sort of rhetorical strategy of framing any kind of opposition as fundamentally irrational because it's emotional. I'm like, but it should be emotional because it's an emotional topic, because you're introducing threats into every one of our lives, and we don't seem to be getting a say in it, really.
Yeah, these are the processes currently going on in Estonia as well. The one private company is looking at sites, and the local communities are kind of protesting, and then the local councils are like in between saying, oh, but maybe it's good, maybe the local people don't matter so much. But we don't have indigenous people in Estonia, or the industry is saying that everybody is indigenous, so it's cool. But I want to touch on this emotions part, because there's also like this extremely pro-nuclear approach. We saw it in the movie, a nice guy singing and talking to these YouTube videos. So something that we have expressed is or felt that when we do any sort of kind of critical communication on this topic on social media, it gets really toxic really fast, and then it gets shut down. So the reason why many of you may have seen the advertisement for this event is that we were assuming that if we put it on Facebook and boost it, it will be taken down in a day or so, because that's what happens before. Because people are reporting it, saying that it's offensive to them, or I don't know, too emotional. But this time it somehow didn't get taken down, so we kind of went crazy with the boost, sorry. But here you are. But the question here is that, start with Kaspar, is that like you have this innovation and technology course where you explain the background of what is technology and how does it develop, and how does it can change you mentally. And then some people become this, like the term on the internet is the nuclear bros, who say that the nuclear is the solution to everything. So can you maybe expand like on this idea that why are they saying this, or is it like a very core thing to their identity and it can't be changed, or can it be changed? Does movies like these help or not?
Okay, there's many questions in one, and I'm probably going to give a lecture now, so you can stop me when I'm getting too lecture-y. This reaction to criticism of technology X being the magic solution is nothing sort of unique to nuclear. So technology is, it's almost like Macroflex or styrofoam or something. It's foam you can put into every crack in every problem, saying, hey, we're going to fix it with technology, we're going to fix it with technology, we're going to fix it with technology, and it becomes synonymous with magic. So if there's any kind of problem, well, we'll fix it. How? We'll invent something. What will we invent? Well, it's going to be something, and it's going to be an invention, and it's going to be great. So it's definitely going to be an invention. Trust this. There's engineers, and there's scientists, and there's physicists, and they're going to invent something. And
They're working on it.
Yeah, they're working on it already, so why shouldn't we trust it? And the problem is that, well, it's magical thinking, it's religious thinking. You're talking about a priesthood of engineers and physicists who are going to pray really, really hard for a magic solution to appear to a problem of our own creation.
The clip of the Fantasyland was real. It wasn't like a comedy clip.
And so, yeah, it doesn't have to be nuclear. It's like everything. And people have this sort of fuzzy thinking about technology, which is why we had this course. Actually, the course has now ended. It's not going to be read anymore. But thinking about technology is fuzzy because the concept of technology is fuzzy. And if you really sort of try to pinpoint it, what it is, you get into really weird conclusions really fast, and you realize, and you lose hope in this sort of magical solution. And I think that when we're talking about nuclear, I don't know if we're preaching to the choir here or not, but you have approximately people who already realize and understand that this is magical thinking and it's not going to lead anywhere. Then you have people who are financially invested in not agreeing with your criticism, which is understandable. And then there's people who might be open to hearing out some arguments, but I think really they're a small minority. And then you have people whose identities are intertwined with their relationship with technology. So people who work in technology, for example, very much opposed to accepting criticism against technology because that would mean criticizing themselves and their jobs, and who would I be if I wouldn't be engaged in the technology. But really, if I'm going to try to wrap my monologue up, a friend of mine who's a physicist asked me why there aren't any physicists here in the panel tonight. And I gave a long answer, and he said, well, I'm hearing about all these arguments against nuclear, but where are your solutions? I want to hear some solutions, man. Like, there's only criticism, but we have a serious problem and we need a solution. I think that's also true for much of technological discourse anyway, not just nuclear. But the thing is that there is no problem that needs solving. Like, climate change isn't the problem. It's the result of us doing things with nature and with technology. And it's the natural consequence of our actions, that we wanted more than we could afford. And now to look at this situation that this goes way beyond CO2 and way beyond climate change. We have now broken across 6 planetary boundaries, and climate is just one of those 6 boundaries, of a 9 total. So 6 out of 9, we're already past. There is no problem. This is the situation we're in, and we're gonna be in because we made it, and there's no way out of it. And people don't want to accept that because that goes against their identity, and it's really depressing thought to think. So then they reframe it as a problem, as an engineering problem, as a nuclear problem or whatever, but really the problem is the solution you're selling. The solution is the problem. There's nothing to talk about. Nuclear is a solution to nothing. It is the source of this problem that we're here discussing. Some people seem to be really, really, really worked up about it, saying that, no, we need some kind of solution. If nuclear isn't your solution, then what is the solution? Why do you expect there to be a magical solution? We need to consume less, pollute less, and if you're not going to do that, which we're probably not, then there's nothing else to do. So,
can I disagree?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. I mean, the part of what you said I really resonate with is there's a kind of manic aspect to this, what clinicians would say, a kind of mania for I'm a clinician too, and so the one concept in clinical psychology is when people are struggling against depression, loss, or mourning, they can kind of move into frantic activity, doing something just to be getting away from sad or difficult feelings, and I think that's a big part of what you're saying. But I also think there are massive material interests in the fossil fuel industry and the nuclear industry and their related extractive industries, and they benefit massively also from making people feel that there's nothing they can do about it. So I wanted this film to also, and some of my previous films are about activism, people coming together and saying, no, there's a better way of living. I mean, there are other ways of dealing with these problems other than just caving into these industries. So I do have still an activist focus. I don't think everyday people contribute to the problem in the same way these companies do that make obscene amounts of wealth. Their lobbying power in the US is shocking. The lobbying power of the nuclear industry and the fossil fuel industry. And there's a young generation of people who are coming up, and fighting that. So I think there's still a lot to be fought, But I agree that there is this kind of frantic grabbing onto technology that that's an illusion. Yeah.
And then before I give it to the crowd, like one warm-up question is that what has been the worst feedback you have gotten about the film, or ways to cancel it or silence this film?
Well, we had I'll make this story short. The CEO head, Jose Reyes, who's head of NewScale, which is kind of the head of the pack in the U.S. They're having trouble. Their costs keep going up, and it's a hustle that's exposing itself here and there. But he's a professor at a university in my state, so we're like fellow colleagues in Oregon. And so I approached him last year. I invited him to be part of the film. I said, there's a public interest in your product. There's been a lot of public money that's gone into this. I think it's important to answer the public concerns. They are not interested in public concerns. It's all just promotional. And I got very far with the communications people, 6 or 7 emails back and forth, and finally they said no, and they just referred me to their Happy Talk on their website. And so I thought, the hell with them, I'll just use their ads. That's how they're communicating. And then we had our big premiere, big opening in a theater in Oregon, and they tried to shut down the film on copyright issues. And then I was able to push back on that. But these companies really are not interested, in my experience, in really meeting people and dealing with having an honest conversation about the downside of their products. And that's one sign of propaganda, is if all you get's a pitch and none of the problems are dealt with, that to me along the way was a sign that this stuff is propaganda. I don't know if I got to your question.
Yeah. It reminded me of this situation. I was, before this screening today, I was giving a kind of testimony to one of the local councils who was debating over whether to kind of go into partnership with a nuclear company, and the council members were also really attacking me, saying that, well, I am not a nuclear engineer. Like, why am I saying these things? I can't be trusted. And then I remember, I kind of reminded them that the other guys are salesmen. Like, these guys can't be trusted. Like, it doesn't make sense that if you have some sort of engineering background, you instantly understand SMRs, which are very difficult kind of propaganda projects and slideshow designs, as they say at the moment. So it's really, there's no one who's really an expert on this. So it's like a fair ground in that sense.
Can I add a point to that quickly?
Yes.
I mean, there's also a way in which, if Reyes, who is a respected nuclear engineer at my sister university, he has spent his lifetime on this and hundreds of millions of dollars. So there is something where you become invested in having to rationalize too. And that's part of being an entrepreneur. I don't think it comes out of just sheer evil, but I think you have to factor in that people have spent a lot of money and their whole career in something, are very invested in wanting it to be true.
Yeah, you have to drink the Kool-Aid. If you're going to do it,
A good salesman is a believer.
Yeah, and if somebody after the day felt that they've been really biased now, then you can maybe go to YouTube and find this kind of really opposite end of the movie called Nuclear Now, which is 2 hours of basically these nice slideshows. Not very critical about nuclear, but then you get the other half, and then you can decide.
Yeah, but you pointed out this another interesting rhetorical sort of strategy of gatekeeping, saying that if you're not a nuclear physicist or an engineer, you're not really allowed to talk about it, and you need a PhD to even have a say. And that's coming from, I think, a very disingenuous understanding of science, or concept of science, which is that science is sort of this one thing, and within this one thing you have these subfields, and if you're not from this subfield, you're not allowed to talk about it. But nuclear energy is such a complex phenomenon that it takes not just engineers or physicists, but also social scientists, psychologists, communication scientists, politicians, and political scientists, environmental scientists, and we could go on and on and on and on with this list to even discuss like what is the reasonable thing to do. You have a whole separate field within science of risk research, risk theory. And for example, if we're talking to some of the people who are engaged in this propaganda in Estonia, and even people who are true believers without financial interest, they're going to be talking about, oh, but we've had such few accidents, only like 3 major accidents, and that's just this one thing you could maybe not notice, but it's this simple argument is coming from a very specific understanding of risk, and there is a risk theory based on frequency, and there is a completely different school of risk in the real world which applies in the case of nuclear that is not discussed because none of these people are risk theorists. So everyone who has sort of within their field some connection to nuclear is allowed to speak on it, and to say otherwise is either stupid or evil. And I don't think like which camp I would put some of these people in, but
I think this leads us to good and smart questions from the audience. So raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. And if you have a comment, then try to keep it short.
If you're not raising your hand, then I'm going to be talking for the next hour. So.
I mean, to be told, these are Estonians, mostly. So Estonians are not very keen on asking questions. But please, about the film, about what we have said so far. I heard somebody clapping back there when I said I was not a nuclear engineer. Maybe that's a topic we want to go deeper into. I'm ready.
Yes, I don't have a question about the film. I have a question about, did you even ask Fermi Energia, anybody to participate here?
Yeah, that was the question Kaspar also asked, right? Or was asked. The answer is no, because our topic here was nuclear propaganda. And the reasoning was that we don't need more propaganda while we are discussing propaganda. That's the short answer. And also, the other funnier answer is that they never invite the environmentalists, so why should we? But that's like a pity answer, so that's not the true one. But yeah, of course we know they exist. They're also in the crowd, so they can always grab the microphone. But it seemed like, I think the film was, like if you cut out the activism part, it was really pro-nuclear. So when I saw it the first time, I was like, damn, it's a commercial for SMRs. So you really have to kind of see the whole thing to realize that, okay, it's like this back and forth of what's promised and what's the reality. But I think they got all the major arguments are there. So it's small, it's cheap, it's... I like this one sentence from the movie, right? That there's not going to be any problems, there's not going to be any risks, just let us build one. And that's the narrative in Estonia as well. Just let us build one and you will see how good it is. But it's not that simple. But I can put Fermi on the spot, and if you want to have a quick comment for balance sake, be my guest.
Can I just add one thing to balance? When I started doing the pre-production research on this for about 6 months, I followed the research, the information online on this, and webinars and TED Talks. Internet was just awash in this pro-nuclear stuff. And there were like some webinars with these guys with their tweedy jackets, these long lectures. You had to be very motivated to sit through them, maybe like us, I don't know. But talk about balance. I mean, I guess it's like labor and management sometimes. I mean, it's, in the US, the influx of the propaganda is so great. I think there's something to be said for claiming some space where you pull back from that and look at kind of what their basic claims are.
And also, like an additional comment is that if you look at like financial resources that both sides have, that we are like really on a shoestring budget. So the only reason Jan is here is because she happened to have a holiday in Estonia, and we used that holiday as a movie screening. So we didn't have money to fly her in. So we're doing it like in a really, really cheap way, trying to get some messages across. So I'm sure Fermi can host many conferences on their own, and maybe one day they will invite us as well.
But I
We
would
will.
like to hear if there's any claim in the movie that's wrong. I've had people who are pro-nuclear who didn't like it, but I have not heard of anyone saying there is a factual claim in it that's wrong. So I think that is interesting.
Please.
As a comment from Fermi Energia, yeah, there's one guy, embodiment of this almighty brainwashing in Estonia for nuclear. Actually, I don't have a question yet, maybe later, but I just wanted to say some comments. First of all, thank you. I came here to with the thought that maybe I can learn something from this movie and from the discussions here, and I really did, and I suppose that most of the public did as well. My job is to explain what nuclear is, and I think that for most of the part, this movie did the same. It explained what the problems with nuclear is. Of course, it didn't really show what the upside of nuclear is, but this is I think it wasn't really the topic of this movie, so it's okay. But in an essence, I think that the better the understanding of what kind of some technology is or isn't helps us to decide which solutions are needed, or maybe they are not needed. Maybe there is something else that we can do to mitigate the problems that we have. Nuclear is just one technology. It's just that. Yeah.
Okay, kas ma võin midagi öelda? Can I say something?
Please.
Yeah. So that's the thing. Like, technology is a thing that exists in the world, and you can study not just a technology, but you can study technologies. And then you can come to understanding about not just nuclear technology or solar or whatever fossil fuels. You can understand what it is that technologies do in general, and then you can maybe see that there are problems that do not have technological solutions because those problems exist because of technological solutions. And so in the case of nuclear, and I have to say I'm also skeptical of every other kind of energy. What you have is an infrastructure project. And when you're building infrastructure, you also need the infrastructure to build infrastructure. And then you need the mines and the factories and the furnaces to make the materials, to build the factory, to build the infrastructure that makes the infrastructure. And what you end up with, whether you're making a bicycle or whether you're making a nuclear power plant, is this whole civilization with its mines and its forges and its factories and its roads. And every part of this technological civilization needs to exist to produce infrastructures, to produce technologies. And the problem that some technologies are supposed to solve is that building infrastructure uses up materials and energy and creates waste. And there is no way to get around that. Whatever the technology is, you're always using materials and energy, and you're always generating waste. And especially when we're talking about technologies that produce energy, we should also ask, what are we doing with this energy? And what we're doing with this energy is propping up a system that is fundamentally unsustainable. So that's why you can't solve climate change with nuclear because the problem isn't climate change. The problem is our unsustainable way of life. And by producing more cheap energy, even if we accept that it's going to be cheap, which is probably not, that's just going to make the problem worse, because the problem was never the climate. The problem was unsustainability within this system that we've built. And so you don't even have to know anything about any specific technology to understand that technological solutions have limits, and that those limits are physical realities that won't go away if you pray really hard or invent really hard, whichever verb you want to use.
That's the indigenous knowledge coming back and saying, like, we told you so, right? 100 years ago. And I mean, the debate is difficult in Estonia as well, because there's a mix between nuclear energy and the small nuclear energy. These are slightly different things. So one exists, the other is trying to be born, but it's very difficult. And there's also this debate on, like, is nuclear a technology, one of the technologies, or the technology that we cannot do without? And I think the private company is pushing the idea that it's the technology we cannot do without. That's what drives me mad, is that that's not at least what the research is saying. But please, more questions. You have a wonderful chance.
Hello.
Yeah.
I have one. Not really a question, just a comment that from the movie and also in the panel, there were said things like, just let us build it. And it's a propaganda selling idea to the people. And once people agree, we're just going to build the nuclear plant, and that's all. It's just wanted to say that it's from the movie, it's a bit misleading. You can say that this movie is also like an anti-nuclear propaganda in a way, because it would have been nice to see implemented in the movie also the rigorous or very strict regulations in the nuclear field. You can't just say, let's build the nuclear plant and that's it. If you look at also at the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, there's a lot of safety studies, there's a lot of regulations you have to follow. It's a years full of process to get the nuclear started. But from this panel and from the movie, the message seemed to be like it's we just sell the idea and we build it and that's all. But in real life, it's a little bit more difficult.
How do you comment?
Yeah, I mean, I had actually thought about doing a whole section on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the history of it. And I respect that agency, even though it's promotes nuclear. But now there's a big fight with these companies that are promoting SMRs. They're trying to reduce the requirements that are important, and some of which came out of the anti-nuclear movement, these strict regulations. And one is there's a perimeter, a safety perimeter around a nuclear plant. I don't know, is that 30 miles? It's a very large one in case of an accident. And they're trying to do a workaround to reduce that requirement so that they say they're safe enough. And so and I guess I can see how it might seem too facetious or too cavalier to say, oh, they're saying, just let us build one. Obviously, they have many barriers. And, you know, I get emails every day about problems they're having, having to resubmit to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for licensing and all of that. So yes, but they are pushing very hard. In Washington, D.C. now, there are many politicians who are saying, we're making it too hard for these new companies. Let them build them. But I agree with your point that could sound cavalier.
I'd venture a guess that the reason that you have such strict regulations is also because of the intense activist contra-movement against nuclear from the 50s to this day. And it would be probably a lot easier to build a nuclear power plant if people weren't up in arms against it, which forces governments and regulatory bodies to enforce some amount of restrictions on building it. Because if you deregulate any kind of industry, what you see is people doing stupid stuff. And so you obviously can't trust them to regulate themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it was in the movie, it was with the Trojan plant as well. Like the death of this plant was within the plant itself, and the way it operated and was designed. So.
And the activists kind of exposed a lot of those.
Yes, I have a question that your movie is based about US experience in nuclear reactors, but is there any experience in the world that a country is so ambitious that he's willing to buy in the technology, the workforce, and kind of like without any knowledge, preemptive experience about this technology? Is there any such small nuclear country whom we might learn from their mistakes, how they're doing? Because like if you're saying like US nuclear costs versus wind and solar we can build in Estonia, but nuclear, we don't have nuclear scientists. So is there any small nuclear states that you are aware of?
There are few in China that are on board, but most of these are still in the planning.
The small country of China.
Yeah, I heard of it. But they are throwing everything at things. But most of these are contracts. They call them subscribers that are still being sold. And in Canada, there's a lot of push for them. And I mean, it is kind of mystifying to me why. I mean, some of it, Ramana, the physicist in the film, who's an international expert on this, said there's a status symbol attached to even the old nuclear plants, that most of them did not do well, and sunk costs were considerable. But it also became a way into becoming a nuclear power. But having a starter set of small reactors, becomes, there's a kind of prestige. Maybe gets back to the fetish of technology. There's a prestige factor attached to this. But most of these are still very much in the design phase.
And why we don't see small countries with large nuclear plants is the same reason why we don't see them in Estonia, even though there was a push in the 60s, a push in the 2000s, is that it's too big for Estonia. But now these small reactors are claiming that we can do it small, and that's why Estonia is looking at it, Romania is looking at it. So there's a lot of these new nuclear countries who are really getting on this bandwagon, and then these US companies are coming over and saying, we can build it. We can build 10 reactors, and Poland is going really crazy with like 20 or more. But they all are these, it will be built by 2030, trust us.
Yeah, just to add on to the doomsaying, if you look at IPCC models, and even in their more rosy predictions, they're saying that if nuclear is to be a consideration, which they're not saying anymore, but he used to say, you would need to build hundreds, if not thousands, of plants within a time frame that is so unrealistic that it's never been done and probably will not be done because the projects are so complex they get pushed back. So it wouldn't even be a solution to it. That's not answering your question, but like even if we managed to find a country that had this experience and import that knowledge and learn from their mistakes, this would not play a part in solving climate change in Estonia or anywhere else, because the scale at which this technology would need to be deployed is unheard of, and also not just the infrastructure which needs to be built, but also the mines and the fuels which don't really exist in such concentrations with such ready availability.
Did you have more questions from that side?
I saw hands. There were hands.
Julgelt, kes tahab küsida?
And why they... yes. There.
If nobody wants, then I can sort of try to formulate the question. But for me, if we're talking about propaganda, nuclear or any propaganda, I would always like to see, as a citizen, of Estonia or any other nation. I would like to see an honest debate without all the pros and cons, let's say, about nuclear, right? And I think this is why, at least for me, the debates have been not only in nuclear but also on other technologies. They have been really difficult to follow. If on one side one side is very honest and the other side is trying to oversell, so you cannot really get the full picture of, okay, what is then the actual picture. So what I would then like as a citizen is always like to bring out the pros and cons of nuclear energy. And I think, for example, to me at least, still there's a lot of unanswered questions. For example, like, are the decommissioning costs calculated in the levelized cost of electricity? Are these nuclear waste costs calculated? Are the possible, accidents calculated in levelized cost of electricity? So all of these things. So yeah, when talked about propaganda, then it seems that, yeah, the more the developers talk and try to make things look pretty, the less me as just a citizen, it is difficult to trust basically to trust them in this debate. So I think if the companies will put more focus on really bringing out the risks themselves, then I think maybe it will help to sell whatever they want to sell. But I think, like, usually they rather would not prefer to bring out the risks and the huge the risk. Yeah. Okay, I will shut up now.
Yeah. Well, they probably wouldn't want to talk about them that much, really. They do, but it's sort of framed always. I think it's an interesting thing that we heard even here, talking about propaganda on both sides, as if there are equal sides which are both furthering some agenda using some resources. But obviously, there aren't equal sides, because on the one hand, you have a company and the people involved have financial interests, and they're not going to be dealing with the problem of nuclear waste because they're going to be dead by then. It's not going to be a problem in their lifetime. And then on the other hand, you have the public represented by NGOs or activists like Madis and I. And well, what's my interest? Like, what's my goal? What am I propagandizing for exactly? I have no interest. I am interested. Actually, I deeply wish that I was wrong. I want to hold none of these positions. I don't want any of these thoughts in my head, but I have come to these conclusions based on arguments and research. No one has so far succeeded in showing how they're wrong, and now I'm forced to think these thoughts, even though I don't want to think these thoughts. I'm sorry about inflicting them on you. And so how is this propaganda exactly? There are no equal sides here. That's another trick in the propagandist playbook, to sort of level the playing field into two opposing camps and then accuse you of doing what they're doing themselves, which is just disingenuous.
Yeah, in an ideal world, there would be like a middleman who would be like, for example, the government, because today in Estonia, because the companies are so radical, then the environmentalists can have to be on the other side of the radical. That's the balance, right? Two radical sides, and there ideally would be a state in the middle, taking all these thoughts into the consideration. But sadly, currently, the state, when you ask the state, like, what's the plan? Like, where are we going to discuss it? They say, we are doing the studies. We will do the studies, and then after the studies, we will decide to go nuclear. So there is no spot currently in the timeline of, okay, we're going to have public debates, we're going to have like experts who are unbiased, like physicists coming, because what keeps me going is that I have a lot of support behind the scenes from experts in the field. They don't want to be publicly involved in this fight because it's so toxic. So like there's always this notion that you can keep in mind that there are more people for or against this idea. They just don't like to be these activists who will be attacked in public, which is understandable. Yeah. Do we have a final question? We have a hand there, and then we will wrap up because soon there will be a next movie here.
Because it's the final question, I just have a question for Jan. What are the next burning subjects you're going to make films about? And the messages there we should know.
Oh, that's a nice question. I've been working on a grant with a colleague of mine in film studies at my university on following the right-wingers that are banning books and shutting down black studies, diversity, another happy topic around the U.S. And I'm interested not just in documenting the horror of our existence, but what people are doing creatively to push back. And you probably are less aware of that to the extent that you follow the right wing, the MAGA crowd in the US, how people are fighting back, and students in universities. So that's what I'm working on now. Thank you for the question.
And my final question would be, since the film was titled The False Promise of the Nuclear Renaissance, so what's your kind of educated guess? How long will this wave last? 2 years, 10 years? When it becomes clear, then, oh, it didn't work again.
Is that for me?
For both of you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is the fastest film. I've made maybe 8 feature films and maybe 8 or 9 shorts. And this film was done very quickly because on a very skinny budget, because I decided this was kind of what's happening now. And if you wait 3, 4, 5 years, who knows where this is going to go. But you know, this all may fall apart, but there's a tremendous amount of money and investment of keeping people busy on this stuff, and the amount of money the U.S. government is putting into this, I find unconscionable. So I don't know. So one of the scientists who's in Sweden now, who I interviewed, she chose not to be part of the film because it was political. I did interview her. Sometimes people then choose not to. She thought a lot of this was these companies get a lot of patents, and a lot of these technologies generate patents, and then down the road, even if it falls apart, it's worth something. So I don't know.
My prediction is that it's going to fall apart before the first shipment of radioactive material arrives in Estonia, which is my goal as an activist. Just to push back on it, delay it until it's not going to happen ever, because climate change and the environmental crisis is going to force us to make decisions about how we're going to spend our resources, and a sort of risky and extremely expensive infrastructure project is probably not just not going to see funding if we go past 10 years on this. I don't think it's ever going to be a thing again.
Yeah, the current state budget also kind of hints that there's a few gaps there. And my guess would be that it's already fizzling. The NewScale that you saw in the film, it's having trouble finding customers in the States, and the owners are already selling their stocks. So if those of you who are part owners of Fermi Energy, you might want to check your portfolio. So with this, just going to remind again that those who live in Tallinn, live in Viimsi, you're welcome in October 4th at 6:30 to the Viimsi library, where we will have like more of presentations and discussion and focus on the Viimsi area, and there will be representatives from the state as well. So not just me rambling, so that's good.
And go to our website, atomicbamboozle.com, if you want to subscribe or give me any feedback on the film, or have any interest in showing it in your university. We're still trying to keep our show on the road. It's great to be here. Thanks again for
Thanks
having
for coming.
me. Thanks.
And have a good night.